So thank you once again for joining us for the third lecture in this year's History of American Architecture lecture series. If any of you don't know me by now, I'm Greg Whitcup, Director of the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. I would like to start by once again thanking our sponsor, the Smith Group. Although they are a global architectural firm with offices around the world, their roots are here in Detroit, where an architect by the name of Sheldon Smith opened an office in 1855. To all of our friends at the Smith Group, thank you for continuing to support the center and the work we do to steward and share Cranbrook's remarkable 118-year history, including the legacy of our architecture and the architects that designed it. While the mission of the center is many-pronged, at the heart of our work is Cranbrook Archives, encompassing nearly 2.5 million documents and records, photographs and negatives. The archives is where the stories are preserved and through which they are brought to life through the work of scholars and students from around the world. Cranbrook Archives also is where you will find Kevin Atkinson on many days and nights, mining its collections for the lectures, presentations, and the Live at 5 tours he leads. Thank you for participating in programs like this and supporting the work we are doing in the archives and across the campus. For those of you that missed one of the first two lectures in this series, don't worry, we are recording them. If you missed one or would like to rewatch one of them, simply send us an email at center@cranbrook.edu and Emma Brick will be glad to send you a link. Finally, I want to call your attention to our upcoming gala fundraiser, a house party at Cranbrook celebrating Loya Saarinen. Although most of us missed the opportunity to meet Eero Saarinen in person and ask him about his architecture, the house party on May 21st will be the next best thing. Our guests of honor include 3 people that knew Eero extremely well, including his son and daughter, Eric Saarinen and Susan Saarinen, as well as his nephew, Robert Swanson. To find out more about this hybrid fundraiser that will include opportunities to celebrate with us in person at Kingswood School or online in your home, visit our website at center.cranbrook.edu. And now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to turn the center's virtual podium over to Kevin Atkinson, our guide extraordinaire to the story of Eero Saarinen and his circle. Take it away, Kevin.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you everyone for joining us for another evening of examining the life and times in the circle of Eero Saarinen. I am delighted tonight to be discussing one of the great domestic works of American architecture, the Miller House. Now, this is a collaboration predominantly between 3 men, Eero Saarinen, Dan Kiley, and Alexander Girard. Before we get started with our slides and our rich visual images of one of my very favorite places in the world, I do want to thank the organizations and people who helped with tonight's lecture, especially the Indianapolis Museum of Art Archives, whose extensive digital collection was invaluable to understanding how the house was constructed and how Girard and Saarinen worked together, as well as the rich Vitra archives, which hold the records of Alexander Girard, and the Library of Congress, which hold the records of Balthazar Korab. I also want to thank Debbie Koski for her work researching Alexander Girard's time in Detroit and her new books on Alexander Girard, as well as Cranbrook Academy of Art graduate Hadley Fruits, who provided many of the contemporary color photos of the house tonight. So let's get started examining another part of Eero Saarinen and his circle. Now, in our first week, we started with Kleinhans Music Hall in Buffalo, New York. Last week, we looked at the General Motors Technical Center. And tonight, we arrive at the Miller House. According to a memoir from Richard Knight, the Miller House was being designed on the first floor and the General Motors Technical Center designed on the second floor. And when we think about the scale of these two projects, one some 900 acres, the other about 8,000 square feet, it is a pretty remarkable duality that the firm had, being able to design a customized single-family home. At the same time, they were designing this magnificent corporate American Versailles. Now, Eero Saarinen's circle tonight is much smaller. General Motors Technical Center was a team effort, and it involved collaboration throughout the firm, throughout Metro Detroit, and throughout General Motors. But to construct the Miller House, we're really looking at a team of about 5 people. Eero Saarinen is front and center, as of course, as the architect and head of Eero Saarinen and Associates. His right-hand man in the design of the Miller House is Kevin Roach, the Irish-American architect who was so involved with this house that within Eero Saarinen and Associates, it was known not as the Miller House, but as Kevin's house. And many of the correspondence and records are between Kevin Roach and the Miller family. There's also Dan Kiley, a landscape architect who worked with Eero Saarinen and Associates throughout the 50s and continued with Kevin Roach and John Dinkloo throughout the rest of the 20th century. Dan Kiley writes in his memoirs that I was fortunate to be brought up poor, which is to say I was rich in freedom of experience and thought. And he describes his neighborhood in Boston as being his first landscape experience, where interconnected alleyways, fenced yards, and layered architectural spaces were there for him to explore and discover. And that's where he developed as a child an appreciation for the sculptural interplay of places. And we'll see this sculptural interplay of places as a real feature of the Miller House landscape. Now, Dan Kiley's training came from being a golf caddy in high school, where he first learned to appreciate gardens, and then working as an unpaid assistant to Warren Manning, who had studied and worked with Frederick Law Olmsted. So a direct connection between Olmsted, the sort of major 19th century landscape architect, to Dan Kiley, one of the fathers of modernist landscape architecture. In World War II, Kiley served in the design division of the US Army, and he experienced European gardens for the first time. It was seeing alleys of trees in France and meandering gardens in Germany that inspired him to bring back a sort of palace architecture for the American landscape, and to attempt to develop a landscape that was not indebted to sort of Louis XIV, but reflected a democratic ideal. And we'll see his landscape designs tonight, and how he took the best of European landscape design and brought it to this country. Now, our next member of our circle is Alexander Girard. He was a sort of multifaceted designer who worked as a trained architect, but also as a head of the textile division at Herman Miller, the furniture company based in Zeeland, Michigan. Girard was also a passionate collector of folk art, a stylist, a designer in many different realms, and he worked alongside Charles and Ray Eames throughout his life, and he is really a co-architect of the Miller House. Alexander Girard was born to an American mother and a French-Italian father. He went by Sandro, the name that he took when he grew up in Florence. He studied at the Architectural Association in London and then at NYU, where he became a licensed architect in New York in the 30s. He came to Detroit in the late 30s and remained here until 1953. His contributions to the Miller House are really what take it from a work of architecture to, in my estimation, a home. And the last member of the circle this week are the clients themselves, J. Irwin Miller and Zinnia Miller. The Millers were described by Eero Saarinen as the perfect client. Together, they completed 4 building projects, 3 of which are now National Historic Landmarks. J. Irwin Miller ran the Cummins Engine Company from 1934 to 1977. He transformed the diesel engine company from a non-profitable job shop to a Fortune 500 company. Miller was known in the 1960s for his role in the ecumenical and civil rights movement. According to one of the Miller's sons, Will Miller, both Eero Saarinen and Irwin Miller saw an opportunity to make a difference in society. For Saarinen, he said he wanted to make a meaningful contribution for civilization. Both men were heirs to powerful traditions and significant families. Eero Saarinen, the lineage of his father's architecture, and Erwin Miller, dating back to the 1840s with business and banking leaders in the small town of Columbus, Indiana. Now, both had strong moral frameworks, with Eero's rooted in the constant respect for the principles which I believe, and Miller's rooted in his Christian faith. Now, Miller is a pretty remarkable businessman. He supported unions in the 1930s at his own company, and he helped to organize the 1963 March on Washington through his presidency of the National Council of Churches. Martin Luther King himself called Erwin Miller the most progressive businessman in America. And Miller helped not only to develop the Columbus, Indiana town through architecture, but he also helped develop the national conscience in issues of race and social justice, becoming one of the first major companies to leave South Africa because of apartheid in the 1970s. Now, Eero Saarinen and Erwin Miller knew each other through a number of different connections. They both had gone to Yale, where they graduated a year apart, or where Erwin graduated a year before Eero arrived. But they really had this deep connection that existed across the entirety of Eero Saarinen's career. As Will Miller would write, the buildings that Saarinen did for my father are among his best, in no small part because they work beautifully in addition to being beautiful. Now, if we were discussing the Miller House in the 1950s all the way up to the early 21st century, we probably wouldn't be discussing much of the Millers. The Millers were extraordinarily private people, and they viewed their house not as a showplace of sort of their own wealth or their own position, but as a family home, a place to entertain the community as well as to hold business meetings. They did not, however, see it as a place to market themselves or the Cummins Company. The Millers set up strict guidelines as to who could photograph the house. They only wanted one photographer to document the project, and they never allowed their names to be published in association with the home. They didn't allow the cost of the house to be revealed, which was substantial, and they didn't even let you say more than just a home in a Midwestern city. However, the Millers knew that they had built something special, and they knew that this project would be transformative, as it was, to both the careers of Saarinen, Girard, and Kiley. Now, when the house was published in House and Garden, it led with this stunning photo by the great architectural photographer Ezra Stoller. And I think that this photo is pretty appropriate for House and Garden, but rather shocking if you think about a more staid architectural publication like, say, Architectural Forum or Progressive Architecture. Instead of clean modernist lines and panels of glass and stone, Stoller has chosen to focus on this rich array of items on the tabletop. Colorful plates matching foil-wrapped candies. And in the center of the table, this elaborate Girard design construction of candles and folk art figurines sitting in a small turf, a lawn on the dining room table that could also double as a fountain or a nightlight. And I think that this is a hint as to the richness of the house and its contents, along with the cover image of the great storage wall, some 60 feet of rosewood and formica and colorful wallpaper and a family collection of folk art. These are the sort of aspects of living that will change the Miller house, as I will argue tonight, from being simply an expression of modern residential architecture into something different that would show a different way that modernism could act as a sort of holder of domesticity at the mid-century. Now, he mentioned both Eero and Erwin had gone to Yale. They also knew each other during World War II when both were serving in Washington, D.C., and they frequently hung out there. But they met when their parents were busy building First Christian Church. Eliel Saarinen was the lead architect, but he worked with Eero Saarinen, his son, and Charles Eames in designing the church. However, Erwin's mother, who was the chairwoman of the board, did not allow the younger gentlemen into the board meetings. And so Erwin, Eero, and Charles Eames would hang out at an ice cream counter down the way and talk about architecture, social issues, and design while their parents were busy planning this sort of great transitional modern Scandinavian inspired church. The church reflects Eliel Saarinen's architectural material palette as well as his design principles. And it features elements of Eames with designing the pulpit, as well as Loya Saarinen designing the great tapestry on the right. Now, Eliel Saarinen had as a patron George and Ellen Booth in the building of Cranbrook. Eliel Saarinen would be working for the Booths from 1925 to 1950. And though not a direct comparison, you could see the relationship of the Booths and Eliel Saarinen in a similar fashion to the Millers and Eero Saarinen. For the entire operation of Eero Saarinen and Associates, there was a project for the Millers on the drawing board. And in Columbus, it is really the sort of basic building blocks of a small Midwestern town: a bank, a house for its most significant resident, and a church. And Columbus, Indiana, in about an hour south of Indianapolis, is not exactly where you would expect to find avant-garde architecture. It really is a sort of classic American Main Street. And yet, through the vision of the Millers and through the deft hand of Eero Saarinen, Columbus has been turned into an unusual place where the churches, schools, and other public buildings, the buildings that touch the lives of everyone, have become designed by an impressive roster of architects. Miller had a sense of commitment to the community, to his family hometown, that was rare at the time and almost inconceivable today. And so though Eero Saarinen launches Columbus's architectural pedigree in the 50s, it continues, as I'll show at the end of the lecture, right up to today. Now, before we get into all the details of our circle, I want to again do a walk through the house. The site for the Miller House was on the far edge of town, almost out of Columbus, Indiana, but still on the main street, Washington Street. 2 miles out of the downtown district, the Millers purchased a farm. The site has a pretty severe change in grade, as at the bottom of the picture, what is the western edge of the site, is the Flat Rock River. Eero Saarinen first proposed putting the house sort of in the middle of the site when Zinnia looked at him and said, "That sounds like a lovely place to put a house, but I don't want to take the children to school in a boat." And so he moved the house closer to the street and out of the floodplain. The landscape is a pretty perfect modernist expression of the garden. The Millers wanted a home of quality, but didn't want ostentation. They also wanted a sense of privacy. And so Dan Kiley, landscape architect, gives them a hedge of alternating arborvitae that lead into a landscape made up of rectilinear grids of orchards and specimen trees, along with flowering shrubs. You can see the house and its pool on the top left of the picture. Driving in, Erwin Miller wanted to have a sort of classical allée of trees, horse chestnuts in the beginning, the same trees that the Saarinens used at Cranbrook Art Museum, and the same trees that Miller had seen when he studied at Oxford after Yale. He took this sort of classical inspiration, but instead of ending the house at the driveway, you actually glance towards the house. And you see this very blank front made up of sort of dark slate with this heavy enameled white cornice line, and then little white columns supporting this roof. The house seems to have no entrance. Jokingly, Aline Saarinen used to say Eero could design a building, but he couldn't design a front door. And the house has this sort of anonymous character from the street. And instead, what you focus on is the landscape and this rich grid of planting. And Dan Kiley would later write that he knew the landscape would receive museum-like care, and that affected the design. His planting details require constant attention to achieve their full effect. When we turn back towards the house, you're looking at a 3-car garage, and the front door is there on the right. As you get closer to the house, what could be a rather dark overhang is sort of animated and lightened by the use of a skylight that runs around the complete perimeter and through the interior of the home. And so instead of just having dark slate walls that are sort of cast in shadow, the sunlight filters through this system of plexiglass and glass skylights and then casts shadows down the wall. At night, fluorescent lights run through the skylight and it illuminates the entire box. You enter the home through these weeping willows and across a carpet designed by Alexander Girard, a couch by the Eameses, and custom art pieces arranged by Girard. The walls are slabs of sand-blasted Georgia marble, several inches thick, and you'll notice that the walls have exposed edges. And this was a detail that Kevin Roach and Saarinen developed so that you understand the thickness of the construction. And it's a detail that Mies van der Rohe used in the 1920s at the Barcelona Pavilion. But you'll notice that the walls seem to float independent of the structure. The entire building, the roof is supported by 16 of these identical columns, and the walls are entirely non-structural. Your view out of the house is blocked by this paneled wall with textile and op art work. And then you turn into the house past a sculptural fireplace. Here we see the long storage wall that's running opposite the garage. And then you step into the first sort of sitting area of the house. The Miller house is based on a 9-square grid, commonly used in Renaissance villas, the architecture of Palladio. But the grid is not fully square and the living room isn't fully centralized. The lights are coming through on the regular grid, but the room is pinwheeling out. And so as we turn our attention towards the western view, out towards the landscape, we pass over what is Saarinen and Girard's great contribution to the sort of mid-century modern home, the conversation pit. And here you see a colorful array of pillows, and you step down, and this was a solution that Girard had been percolating in his own architecture, and it achieved Eero Saarinen's desire to not have a sort of crowding of furniture in the living room, but could you get a domestic space down to the most minimal pieces of furniture required by actually sinking down most of your conversation seating into the floor. Now, for Girard, these domestic interiors were a continuous, ever-changing work in progress. For him, a house could never be a one-off design project, but instead must constantly evolve. And so as the Millers live in the house, they are adding things to it, including the Girard-designed dollhouse on the right and the custom Steinway on the left, where, realizing that you would see the bottom of the piano from the conversation pit, they have Steinway painted Mrs. Miller's favorite red color and then give it custom brass pedals and a custom piano bench. Now, the conversation pit would change with the seasons from white to red, with the pillows and plants reflecting the sort of seasonal interest from the garden and bringing the outside in. Meanwhile, the glass windows recede entirely into the walls of the house, and you have an opening from this sort of storage wall at the back, past the fireplace, over the conversation pit, and into Dan Kiley's landscape, where the house is extended on a plenum, and you have this sort of duality of the conversation pit sunk in the living room to the pool of water sunk into this covered terrace. Now, eventually, the Eameses would produce outdoor furniture for the Miller house. In these highly stylized Ezra Stoller photos, you can see that most of the furniture, except for select pieces, have been cleared out for that sort of artistic architectural look. But the Millers really did live here, and they really lived in this sort of traditional American porch, overlooking a vast lawn that heads down to the Flatlock River. Now, Kiley came onto the project as landscape architect after the house was already designed and under construction. Irwin told him that he loved the gardens of Europe, particularly those in France and Spain. And Dan Kiley used this as a chance to twist and sort of mutate the European classical garden principles into a modern expression. So what it looks like you're looking through just sort of a series of trees, you're actually looking perpendicular through a more classical allée. And so the allée is running parallel to the house, and you can only experience this row of trees by stepping out into the first of a series of garden rooms. This one looking towards what the family called Henrietta, a Henry Moore reclining sculpture. But unlike a classical European landscape, which might simply end at Henrietta, Kiley is constantly allowing you to turn out and into these rows of trees. And he's suggesting that you move through the landscape in a non-linear, it's sort of exploratory fashion. It was a series of landscapes that don't lead, but that simply open and show you where you might go next, including down to the vast lawn where the Miller's 5 children would play, and where at the very back of the landscape, a more naturalistic garden bordering the river allows this view back to the house up sitting like the Acropolis on this low sort of streamlined hill. Coming back inside from the gardens, we see this pinwheel effect leading into the dining room, divided from the living room by a curtain on a mechanized rail. We see here a pedestal table that was eventually accompanied by Eero Saarinen's pedestal furniture for Knoll. Looking over the table, you see that the landscape continues out another series of glass doors that slide into the pocket of the building and completely disappear, allowing the Millers to eat outdoors. And then this garden again has this sort of balanced asymmetry where there's a very formal grid of plants, but it's not quite centered on the dining room. What is centered is this Roman bath where Erwin and Zinnia purchased this 2nd century alabaster bowl and asked Aunt Kiley to incorporate it into the landscape, a little bit of the Rome they loved here in Columbus, Indiana. But once you actually get to this feature in the distance, you understand again that you're in a sort of garden room and can turn in any direction. Now, the Miller House is at once a very traditional design that was designed for a staff. At the same time, the Millers did do some of their own cooking, and they would entertain smaller dinners and family meals here in the Eat-In kitchen with its Eames Eiffel chairs and its Girard fabrics, and then a backsplash of multifaceted glass tiles. To give you a sense of how very involved with the design the Millers were, in a letter that Erwin Miller wrote to Kevin Roach, he said, "Make sure you include a permanent location for the can opener and roll of paper toweling. In all our other kitchens, we do not have a place for these, and instead of becoming a permanent fixture, it becomes a permanent nuisance." And so you have this architecture firm that's designing the tech center on the one hand, and on the other, getting these letters saying, make sure you have a place for the paper towels. And that extended into where do you hang the laundry to dry? And so a custom screen hides the laundry. Where do you take the trash? You put it into these sunken garbage cans that lift out of the plenum below the beautiful slate walls. In each corner of the houses are little private compounds. One corner houses the Miller's own bedroom with bedspreads and curtains by Alexander Girard, and a wall of pegboards with family mementos, including the deed of the house and Erwin Miller's cover of Esquire magazine, when in the 1960s that publication said, "This man should be the next president of the United States." The pegboard opens to reveal the family television, which is, of course, one of those great elements of domesticity that no designer really wants to have sitting out. Attached to the bedroom is a dressing room, bathroom, and a his and hers desk where Zinnia and Miller could work on their family sort of management of the household, but also their various charitable projects and organizations. Off the living room is a little family den, behind which is the children's wing, which Eero Saarinen said he designed in the manner of traditional Finnish houses, where you have a large playroom seen here, and off of it are small little cellular bedrooms for each of the 5 children. And in these hyper-efficient bedrooms, this is the guest bedroom, you have all built-in cabinetry, so nothing is left to chance. And that language of the storage wall continues on into the bedrooms. And again, from the south side of the house, you exit through a row of magnolias and out towards the family pool, entered in through an Alexander Girard gate. And so with this walkthrough of the house, I hope that you've gotten a sense of just how special and sort of incredibly rich this interior and exterior architecture is. And my point at the beginning that this sort of exterior of the building is the least significant part is really supported by this idea of the sort of floating roof with rooms that open into the landscape and the landscape that comes into the house. And I think this idea that the actual look of a house is the least important part of its design is something that is present in all of Eero Saarinen's 18 house designs, built and unbuilt. And it's also pretty true of Eliel Saarinen's design here at Cranbrook, where on the right, the house that was Eero Saarinen's home away from college and when he was a young man, he would have returned to Eliel and Loya Saarinen's house at Cranbrook. And from the outside, the president's residence here at Cranbrook is a very simple brick building. It lines up aesthetically with all the other two-story brick buildings along Academy Way. And yet inside, it is all about the inside. You have this rich array of architectural textiles, handmade tiles, custom furniture, everything in its proper place, everything designed as this total vision, this total work of art by the Saarinen's family. And of course, what is sitting out in the house is really kept to a minimum, but it's features of contemporary art and folk art. Now, the dining room of Saarinen House, I think, is a sort of direct inspiration to the dining room at the Miller House, where again, we have a round table, this one much smaller than the Miller's, underneath a round dome, and connected to the living area through this sort of open flowing floor plan. What divides the two rooms but curtains, the same material that Eero Saarinen would use 25 years later to divide the living and dining space of the Miller House. Also within Saarinen House is, I think, a compelling precursor to the conversation pit at the Miller House. And that's the bench raya in Loya Saarinen's cozy corner. Bench raya were a Finnish seating form that was a distinct sort of Finnish folk craft of running your hand-knotted rugs from the floor over the bench and sometimes even up the wall. The bench raya, full of pillows here, was called the cozy corner, and it served as the family den. This is where they sat after dinner. This is where they had their architecture students for conversation and where they celebrated holidays. And it opens clear out across the studio at Saarinen House, which sometimes held drafting tables, other times was used as a formal event. And you have this sort of built-in cozy corner overlooking this vast volume of space. Now, Eero Saarinen was not involved in the design of Saarinen House. However, he is involved in other projects with his father, including the Kobel House in Grosse Pointe, where again you see Saarinen's interest in an open floor plan that divides a living room and a dining room, originally with portieres, with curtains, and which houses bedrooms upstairs that have built-in furniture that seems to connect between the scale of the architecture and the scale of the body. It's also very efficient to constantly use these built-in beds, desk, and cabinetry. In one of the very first projects Eero Saarinen was ever published an architectural forum for, he won a competition to design a speculative combination living dining room study. What's interesting is it's an architecture that has no exterior. There is no sort of architectural expression. Instead, you have this room that has a flexible arrangement of Alvar Aalto designed furniture that connects the living and dining area. In another house project from father and son, the Vermouth House, designed for Cranbrook's chief contractor and in Fort Wayne, Indiana, you see this sort of bifurcation of a living wing on the right end, and then bedroom wing, which is raised up on pilotis. Now, why in the world are the bedrooms flying up above this sort of cow pasture? I'll never know. The best explanation is that Eero Saarinen is looking to Europe, and he's looking at Le Corbusier and the Villa Savoy, and he is doing what every other modern architect is, which is to raise up your house on little steel columns. And then on the inside, again, we have a flowing floor plan anchored by, at the center, this sort of storage wall element. And you can see all the ideas that are in the Miller House percolating through these earlier residential designs by Eero Saarinen. Here, this storage cabinet features a mural on one side, and on the back side, storage for books, magazines, the television, and phonograph or radio. But the house that I think most sets the stage for Eero's design of the Miller House is his contribution to the case study program in Los Angeles. Designed with Charles Eames for the publisher of Art and Architecture magazine, the Entenza House is constructed by elevating a steel girder system on thin steel columns and then having entirely flexible space below that's filled in with corrugated metal, plywood, or glass. And it's all centered on this sort of dynamic sculptural fireplace that has a built-in lamp shining up at the ceiling and reflecting back down. And it has this sinuous, curvaceous sort of precursor to the conversation pit in this built-in couch that's overlooking the garden. Now, the Entenza House, which is this sort of roof with rooms below, is sitting next to the Eames's own house, which is this sort of steel girder and paneled construction. And it is not just sort of in the air in California. Closer to home in Michigan, we have the architecture of Alexander Girard. He designs just about 4 houses in Metro Detroit, all in one area of Grosse Pointe, for a series of clients who are interested in a modern expression. Now, Girard is working on many of these projects with Minoru Yamasaki, and you'll see the similarity of design language between Eames, Saarinen, and Girard, where you have paneled construction, steel girders that are supporting the roof of the Girard house here. And then in this McLucas house, Girard is reusing leftover bricks from the General Motors Technical Center. And so I think beyond just the sort of aesthetic that is in the air in this immediate post-war period, if he's using bricks from the tech center, we know that Girard and Saarinen have to be friends. Now, Alexander Girard came to Detroit from New York in the late 1940s to work for the Detrola company designing radios. It can be overwhelming to study Girard. He designed buildings, interiors, corporate identities, textiles, wallpapers, chairs, tables, vases, clocks, radios, lighting, dresses, murals, cards, stamps, coins, flags, posters, toys, logos, and lettering. Anything that you could do to make your surroundings more beautiful, more interesting, Alexander Girard designed it. His first partnership with Eero Saarinen was on the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial Competition, the Gateway Arch, where Girard contributed the idea of a sort of assemblage collage mural that would have been located in the visitor center underneath the arch. And it has this inspiration from sort of American folk painting, but it's displaying the sort of culture of the Mississippi River with these amazing artistically inspired steamboats sailing by. Now, Girard and Saarinen, of course, win this competition. Another member of the team was Dan Kiley. And so you see how all of these men are already associated in 1947. Girard and Saarinen also worked together for this honorable mention for a Museum of Modern Art textile that Eero and Girard designed together in 1946. But Girard's contribution to the understanding of modern domestic space is best exemplified by a landmark exhibition that he staged in 1949 at the Detroit Institute of Arts. Supported by the auto industry, funded by J.L. Hudson, and sort of supported by the larger Detroit sort of community leaders like Eleanor Ford, For Modern Living was meant to be a show that would, and I quote, raise the level of taste among Detroit consumers. The show is to be educational about modern design and modern interiors, not commercial. Girard spent extensive amount of time writing about what the principles of modern architecture were. And he worked with Eero Saarinen and Minoru Yamasaki to completely redesign the DIA. You entered underneath a Saul Steinberg drawing of a person sitting in a modern chair, resting their feet on this sort of Victorian carved wooden chair. And you came into a great hall, which Girard designed as a sort of showpiece of new interiors. The show swung you to the left, where you went into a series of exhibits. First, a history of modern design, a mural by Steinberg, the Hall of Objects, and finally the Great Hall. But the entrance to the exhibit is rather telling. One is faced with two choices. On the left, a dead end of repetition, and on the right, a new road. And you'll see that the dead end of repetition is a mirror reflecting a silk brocade with a Chippendale chair in the front. And so you have to choose the new road, where Girard and his co-designers make an argument that modernism is not a sort of radical European design, in his words, cooked up by the long-haired nuts and radicals across the Atlantic. That's what he writes in the catalog. But instead, modernism is rooted in American life. And so he traces the design of Mises and Breuer's cantilever chairs back to a 1917 jump seat from an Owen magnetic touring car, and even further to an 1857 R.L. Howard mower. And so he sort of positions modernism in the great tradition of American industrial ingenuity. And he's really relying on the book Mechanization Takes Command, which argued that America's contribution to modernism were inventions like these industrial equipments taken into domestic spaces. But the next room was really Girard's tour de force. Using a new system called the Unistrut, he develops this hall of objects from a list of starting with 6,000 options. He shows some 2,000 American and machine-made items, everything from fans to slinkies to radios to typewriters. There is no retail information, there is no cost information. Instead, it is displayed in what Girard called the jungle gym as art, decorative and functional art. And in the catalog, you could see the index of designers. Then, after you had seen this sort of overwhelming jungle gym of products that you could bring into your domestic environment, you entered into this fantasy landscape of the Great Hall, where you climbed up a 300-foot-long multi-level ramp, passing rooms designed by Alvar Aalto, Jens Reisem, Bruno Matheson, Florence Knoll, Charles Eames, and George Nelson. Now, in Knoll's little room, her period room, it has that Knoll look. It would be as at home at the Tech Center as the Connecticut General Life, and I'm not sure how homey it would be in your own interior. But it is all products made by Knoll Associates. For George Nelson's interior, you see the inclusion of his storage wall. George Nelson was another Yale-educated architect who in the 1930s and 40s was an important architectural critic and publisher in Manhattan. He published the 1948 book called Tomorrow's House, in which he proposed the storage wall as being the solution to modern life. The attention that his book, Tomorrow's House, brought him led to his being hired by Herman Miller in Zeeland, Michigan, as its head of design, a role that Nelson would spend the rest of his career doing. And so here we see Nelson proposing that essentially every item of the home can exist within the storage wall. And then the last room was the Eames's, which was not a sort of functional room. It wasn't a living room or a bedroom. It was a flexible space. It was meant to be not an efficient machine for living, but an inspirational area. And you'll see that the Eames, instead of using a storage wall, on the left-hand side, they have a pegboard on which they display their own pieces from their collection of folk art, Japanese paper kites, and paper flowers that they handmade. And there's a certain whimsy to the proposal of what it would be like to live in an Eames interior. And I think that Girard very much resonated with that sense of whimsy. And on the back cover of the exhibition catalog, Steinberg illustrates the Eames's potato chip chair, certainly the most famous chair in America at the time, with a little lace doily over it. And it's a little bit perplexing as to whether this is a critique of Americans refusing to sort of chuck out their chintz in favor of modernism, or as I would read it, Girard saying, you can't have a doily and an Eames chair. He's proposed one way for modern living, but in fact, why not have it all? That's not quite what the exhibit said, but these rather sort of invasive illustrations seem to present a modernism that might be more complicated. Now, the Museum of Modern Art was, according to the DIA director, flustered and upset that Detroit should have put on such an important show instead of their museum. It was the most attended show in the history of the DIA to date, with over 150,000 viewers coming through. Meanwhile, at MoMA, they had constructed the Bauhaus master Marcel Breuer's vision for a home, and this was a butterfly house where you had living room stacked on one, or a bedroom stacked on one side, a central living area, and then a service building. Very much this idea of the bifurcated house, Breuer's vision of modern living. And inside of the museum building, it had an interior with Knoll furniture. At the same time these shows are going, Eero Saarinen is beginning to build his first project for the Millers, a vacation home in Ontario. The Millers had summered in Ontario on this piece of property since the 1880s, but did not have a permanent cottage. They asked Eero Saarinen to propose a building that would have room for the children, room for Erwin and Zinnia, and then living space. And you'll see that the floor plan is completely amorphous with no right angles. And we think about the design of the Great Hall at the DIA with its meandering ramp. And then we think of Breuer's more rigid, gridded modernism. And I think that Eero is sort of turning towards this idea that modernism can be whimsical, that it can be sort of unique and expressive. And the building sits on the rocky edge of a peninsula, and it sort of hangs out over the water in a series of materials that might best be described as sort of indigenous construction: wooden board and batten walls, glass, and a giant copper shed roof. To actually approach the building from the land side, you come across a stone terrace and you enter in underneath the children's bedrooms, with the parents' bedrooms on the right and the living spaces on the left, overlooking the lake. It was a sort of reinterpretation of the modernist division of public and private space, this time centered around an outdoor living court. Now, Alexander Girard is hired by the Millers as the interior decorator and color consultant. And so when we step inside the house and we see these Florence Knoll chairs and Saarinen furnishings and Eames furnishing, it's all within a sort of architecture of Eero Saarinen and color story of Alexander Girard. When we get into the dining room, we see custom rugs that Girard designed that have the family cat and folk-inspired little snakes, and also the pairing of sort of rocking chairs, the quintessential American porch furniture, with Eames's potato chairs, chip chairs at the dining room. And then in the bedroom, we have this multi-step terrace. And this could be seen as the sort of modernist division of always changing elevations, and very much the sort of use of materials like stone and wood becomes popular among the modernists in this sort of American vernacular. And even architects like the Bauhaus's Breuer begin designing sort of clapboard painted wooden buildings with fieldstone walls. But Saarinen is looking as much to Breuer in his architecture, I think, as to America's most famous vacation home, Fallingwater, where, much like Edgar and Lillian Kaufman asked Frank Lloyd Wright to not destroy any of the boulders on their property, Erwin and Zinnia Miller asked Eero Saarinen to not use any dynamite, to not place his building sort of in the hill, but on top of it. And so their bedroom is actually crossing up and over a boulder, much the same fashion that Frank Lloyd Wright would design the fireplace of Fallingwater into the boulder of the site. Now, if we look at the floor plan for the Miller cottage on the left, and we look at the floor plan for another house that Eero Saarinen is designing at the exact same time, we see sort of two approaches to modern architecture. On the left, a building that fits like a glove, the sort of family needs for a cottage, that's also built specifically for the topography of this cliffy hillside. And on the right, we have Arrow's entry into the great tradition of modernist exploring glass boxes. And this was a glass box for his mother, built here in Bloomfield Hills following Eliel Saarinen's death. Loya had to leave the Cranbrook campus, leave Saarinen House, and so Arrow designed her a little mother's suite in his backyard. It has a central glass living room with a bedroom wing on the right and a kitchen and service area on the left. The entire thing is dimensioned to her hand-woven textiles from Saarinen House, and it's filled with the sort of objects of her family's design lineage. And this building, more so than the Miller's Cottage, seems to be engaging with the important architectural debate, sort of capital A architecture of glass boxes. And I show here on the left the two most famous glass boxes in American architecture. And these two buildings, completed around 1950-51, are really, I think, the context from which the Miller House will spring. And both buildings express a very specific idea of domesticity and family life and how architecture might provide for domestic space. And I think we'll see that this is a very different vision of modern living than what Alexander Girard had proposed about the same time, 1949, at the DIA. So starting with the Farnsworth House, it is pretty much perfection in architecture if your idea of perfection is rooted in sort of machines and grids. It is a perfect one-room house that features this high quality of construction with engineers from Porsche coming over to grind down the bolts of the building so as to express this sort of perfect steel and glass pavilion. But the client was a Dr. Edith Farnsworth, and she was a single woman in her 40s who, according to her own memoirs, was simply tired of being tortured by being a single woman in her 40s and having nothing to do on weekends and being seen as this sort of outlier, this failure of American domesticity. So she wanted a retreat that was at once an architectural sort of statement, but was also a way of escaping the city. Now, how exactly Mies felt she should live in it was to live with his furniture. And for most of the house's history, it has had Mies's Barcelona furniture from 1929. He tried to get Dr. Farnsworth to use pink suede versions of his own furniture. But in fact, how exactly she occupied this modern architecture was very different. She brought family heirlooms, she brought her own furniture, she brought her own textiles and rugs. Ultimately, Dr. Farnsworth and Mies had a huge falling out over this house, many court disputes about its sort of lack of function and the lack of meeting her needs. And she said in a publication that Mies didn't want a friend and collaborator in a client, he wanted a dupe and a victim. And I think that this sort of intersection of furniture Mies didn't want in a house that he viewed as perfect shows this sort of broader issue of how gender and domesticity might actually occupy modern architecture. And when we think about Mies's views of domesticity, let's look at this 1927 poster from a show in Stuttgart, where Mies asked how to live, and he answers it by putting a giant red X over a Victorian interior. And by eliminating the sort of classical realm of feminine domesticity, the decoration of the home and the collection of objects and heirlooms, Mies and other sort of modernists were cutting into the consumer culture as well as to the sort of family structure of what it meant to be a woman of a certain class and how one constructs identity and memory through the home. This threat against heirlooms was in favor of a pure architectural style, but it was also a pretty severe departure about what it meant to be a family and what it meant to have a home. Now, our parallel glass house by Philip Johnson is perhaps more usable than the Farnsworth house, but it still begs the question of how a glass box might be a usable home and not just an ideal architectural object in an ideal landscape. Philip Johnson was both the client, the architect, and his own critic, he was also gay. And there's something very profound about him bringing this radical architecture into the conservative, wealthy enclave of New Canaan, Connecticut. Now, he famously referenced the fireplace as the sort of center of the American home and controversially parallels it to a burning village that he saw during World War II. But I think the only war that was happening in his house was the sort of war of this gay man moving into an all-glass house in New Canaan. He puts the house on a brick floor, he gives himself storage walls, and he also admits to the complexity of having a domestic space in a glass box by building a second building, a little brick guest house. Now, the guest house was referred to as by Arthur Drexler as a little series of closets, and it really did serve as a way for Johnson to have this overt life in the glass house and then his private life within this sort of ballet modern, as the New York Times called it, of the brick guest house. Now, there is this tension of how exactly one occupies modern architecture. And it was picked up in the popular press by editors like Elizabeth Gordon, who in House Beautiful says, "These homes, these glass boxes are unlivable. It is a self-appointed elite trying to tell us how we should live and what we should like." Elizabeth Gordon interviews Dr. Farnsworth, and she says, "I've talked to a highly intelligent, disillusioned woman who spent $70,000 on a one-room house that is nothing but a glass cage on stilts. If we can be told by dictators in matters of taste how our homes are to be ordered, then we certainly should be prepared to expect dictators in other departments of life. This is a well-developed move against the heart of our society." And so you essentially have the editor of House Beautiful coming out against these glass boxes as being fundamentally un-American and undomestic. Now, I introduce these just to further contextualize how radical I view Alexander Girard's contributions to the Miller House, where House and Gardens runs the Miller House not as some sort of radical warning against sort of the perils of modern design, but as the hallmark house of the year, where a visual richness delights the eye in a total environment that nurtures the spirit of the people who live in it. And so Eero Saarinen initially proposes this more glassy pavilion, but by working with the client, he comes to something that is much more enclosed and much more rich. He did, however, give the Irwins one glass box, and that was the bank in downtown Columbus. I mentioned that he builds 4 buildings for the family. We saw the cottage in Canada. This was the next project to build the family bank, to move out of a solid 3-story Victorian building and into this glass pavilion, featuring 9 shelled domes illuminated just like at Saarinen House by a central light. It has been described by Will Miller as a skillful blend of Miesian formality with warm Cranbrook touches. And I think it demonstrates how Eero Saarinen viewed the glass box as functioning, not as a domestic space, but as a civic space, as a bank, where filled with Knoll furniture, you would have such modern implements as one of the very first drive-through windows, but you're not actually living in the glass box. Instead, for the Miller House, he proposes this large suspended roof that would then be subdivided into the 4 quadrants. So on one quadrant, you have the kitchen and service wing, maids' rooms, and a storage basement. The next quadrant is the primary bedroom suite, then the children's bedroom suite, and finally the garage and guest suite. And then the interior space pinwheels around these enclosed volumes. And if you notice in this presentation drawing of the blueprint, that the private spaces are rendered in dark brown, the public spaces are the color of the paper, and it continues past sort of what are the sliding glass walls. So it's showing how the public aspects of the house really are meant to extend in all directions. The center of the house is a sort of bifurcated center, where on the one end you have the sunken conversation pit, and on the other, a fireplace. Now, the design of the fireplace was developed by Balthazar Korab with Eero Saarinen. Korab was a Hungarian-American architect and photographer based out of Detroit who had immigrated from Budapest at the end of World War II. And he came to work for Eero Saarinen, and he said he spent 3 months laboring on the fireplace, and it was an incredibly frustrating experience because he was fresh from impoverished post-war Europe. Such an extravaganza was puzzling, so much energy spent on a simple task. And yet I think it reflects the dedication to experimentation that Eero Saarinen had with every element of design. And the fireplace proposals are a wide range of mid-century styles. And the one that they settle on initially is this sort of sculptural plaster form. And I love this color photo of the model taken by Korab of his little plaster fireplace, because it already shows the influence of Girard with these colored paper panels set into the storage wall. And it is hard to look at the finished building and not see this sort of on the one hand, extraordinary, almost Victorian richness. On another hand, this sort of high camp of the entire project. And the way that this very clean, streamlined architecture is enriched by its second architect, Girard. Now, the structure is anchored by these skylights. And these were developed between Saarinen and Kevin Roach. And it's a little bit perplexing because if you have a grid of 16 columns, you would think that the columns would be supporting the beams of the roof. But in fact, where the beam should be, sort of centered on this column, is then a skylight. And what you have is a welded grid of double steel columns. So there's a steel column here and a steel column here. And then in the center is a channel allowing for the skylight to bring light along the grid and to wash down along the Georgia marble walls and to illuminate all of the art in the home. And Saarinen is very careful in placing the skylights. They come across the walls inside and out in the living space. They come above the vanity in the bathrooms, but none of the bedrooms are ever underneath a skylight. Construction on the project was complex and slow. And in the archives at the Indianapolis Museum of Art, we have this letter from Irwin Miller to his contractor, where writing from Canada, he says, what I think is happening, his sort of house baking in the sun with the worker laying under the tree, and what I want to be happening with 1,000 little workers and all of their cars lined up, trying to bring this house to completion before the 5th child is born that next year. Spoiler alert, they do not finish it on time. Now, as the house is under construction, what in Saarinen's initial designs are a very straight, sort of gridded landscape is transformed by Dan Kiley into the series of outdoor rooms that we saw in our walkthrough, where alleys of trees and sort of gridded groups of planting are extending the language of zones and pinwheeling space from the architecture out into the landscape. By the time that Girard is hired on this project, remember he had already worked on the Canadian project, Girard was also made head of textiles at Herman Miller. Joining in this Herman Miller ad on the left, George Nelson as the sort of design director, as well as Charles Eames, who had in some sense betrayed the Knowles and gone to work in-house for Herman Miller. And now Girard finishes the third of the great Herman Miller design trio, Nelson, Eames, and Girard. And so as head of textiles, I think that is also his biggest concern in the Miller house. And in this amazing paste up where you have the floor plan of the house, Girard is layering in all of the textiles that he proposes to use on the house. Now, this is very much a conversation with the Millers, and he will go to great lengths to redesign, reselect, provide new options in almost every instance of the house. When it comes time to actually installing the material, Girard schedules the 2-week extravaganza that includes dusting the whole construction site, unboxing all of the stuff he has bought, bringing in the curtain maker from New York, setting up the whole house, taking an overnight train to Manhattan, setting up 3 days of shopping for the family, followed by Zinnia taking the overnight train and doing 4 days of selection. So they plan in advance, they install it, and then they sort of continue to shop in this total designed work of art. I want to spend just a moment here looking closely at this plan. where we can see here Girard proposing the winter pit pillows and then drawing a line into the conversation pit. And in the archives, we can see all of the mixture of textiles, some new, some vintage, some by Herman Miller, some by Knoll. And so he proposes here a color scheme for the winter. And then in the grand tradition of much more traditional and older style homes, a scheme for the conversation pit in summer. It's a mixture of ecats, this one a tie silk, to hand-woven textiles like this one by Cranbrook alum Jack Linner Larson, associated most with Knoll, or Girard's own contributions to his line of some 300 products issued by Herman Miller. And then the conversation pit can transfer over time from its summer to its winter appearance. And the conversation pit seems so new, so cutting edge. It seems so iconic to the 1950s house. But remember, I think it has a direct chain back to the cozy corner of Saarinen House, designed in 1930, to Girard's own projects like his house for the inventor of Benadryl in Grosse Pointe, which has a sort of pseudo-conversation pit. But it even goes back to the 19th century, to the cozy corners found in American middle and upper class homes, where there was a craze for what they called Turkish inspired, sort of inspired by a vague idea of the sort of Middle East and North Africa, where, according to one author, Turkish cozy corners have run like a forest fire through the homes of the gay 90s. Decorative bits of Eastern metalwork, embroidered pillows, and inlaid furniture provide a seductive dust trap of the stuffy home. And they were places that were both critiqued by sort of design professionals, but they were also a chance for the women of the house to display their cosmopolitan nature, to sort of collect one understanding of the world and to then display it. I think that the conversation pit at the Miller House is a continuity of this cozy corner form, but a slight shift in meaning, as we'll see. Elsewhere in the house, Girard is specifying more explicitly his own designs for textiles, like in the master bedroom, where he uses a cutout design. And on the right, we see from his archive how he's used tissue paper in a Polish craft tradition to actually design what becomes a screen printed cotton. And then here the curtains on display. Or elsewhere in the house, in the children's bedrooms, you have 3 sons, and you have 3 different colorways of his printed curtain textile hanging here. And for Girard, he once said, textiles are a building material, as much a part of a room as are the conventional materials of brick, glass, wood, and plaster. And in that way, Girard's curtains, I think, are a very sly invader into the sort of pure and clean architecture of Eero Saarinen and Kevin Roach. However, I also think it is a welcome invader, because if we think about Eero Saarinen's own respect to textiles and his mother's use of textiles in the house, I think Eero comes from an understanding where curtains and pageantry and textiles are part of an architectural expression. They aren't decorations layered onto the architecture, they're an integrated part of its design. Now, at enormous expense, and an expense that Erwin Miller continuously questions, the actual maker of the curtains and upholstery is a significant New York decorator. Ernest Lonano had a decoration firm established by his father that ran from the early 20th century up through 2013. And Lonano are selected by Girard because he basically says the curtains have to be perfect, the house is structurally perfect, there is only one perfect upholsterer and perfect curtain maker in this country. What's fascinating about Lonano is that he was not known as a modernist. In fact, he was known as a textile historian who did all of the upholstery and curtain work for houses at Colonial Williamsburg and for people like Henry Francis DuPont at Winterthur. And it is quite possible that Lonano, who would travel to Columbus, Indiana to change out the conversation pit upholstery, was in the same sort of circuit of spring to summer to fall changeovers, heading then to winter tour, where Linano also oversaw the changing out of curtains from seasons. And in both cases, at both the sort of colonial revival architecture of winter tour and this chic cutting edge modernism of the Miller House, the designers are changing the curtains and the textiles as a response to the changes in the landscape. And so these textiles are framing views out into the garden. The garden is a living work of design. Therefore, the textiles in the home will also change and evolve, and the color scheme will always stay harmonious. I mentioned that Girard viewed the house not as a static object. And so quite quickly, by the time that they're actually reupholstering pillows, because it is a family of 5, Girard is still designing the house. So into the 60s and 70s, he is adding new elements like this heraldic rug in the study, where to Girard's own distinct brand of graphic design, he incorporates the love of the Miller family, music, transportation, the diesel engine, the ES for Eero Saarinen, a little cat for their daughter Kitty, as well as abstract plans of the bank downtown with the 9 grids of domes, or a more sort of abstract traditional bank reflecting the family's interest. And so he's bringing a language of heraldry that would have existed in a sort of landed European home and bringing it into this modern corporate CEO in a very whimsical and effective manner. In the dining room, Girard designs a rug that, according to the family, the pattern gets more dense under the table because that's where the children would spill. And then the pattern becomes more white towards the exterior. Of course, Linano was also cleaning these rugs in New York every time the family was in Canada, and the maintenance on the house was pretty intense. After Florence Knoll and Eero Saarinen launched the Pedestal series of furniture, Eames's Eiffel chairs are switched out, and we see here in the dining room of the Miller House the original marble pedestal table surrounded by pedestal chairs. Girard could have simply selected the cushions, but instead he designs needlepoint patterns. Each member of the family had their initials designed in this illustration of a grid with gouache, and then Girard sent these sort of textile samples with his colors off to Zinnia Miller, who, with her bridge club, needlepoints all of the chair covers, and they are then sent to Florence Knoll, who fabricates them in their Pennsylvania studio into official Knoll cushions. And so here you can see a wonderful detailed shot showing that needlepoint, and here the way that the chairs interact between the sort of layers of design between Eero's chair to Girard's rug and cushion. And I think it all sort of contributes to this almost festival-like atmosphere where Girard is providing essentially everything the family needed in the house, but he is looking across time to ideas of domesticity in needlepoint. It's classically known as women's work, sort of ideas of homemaking, of selecting items, of styling items, but doing it in this very modern way. Now, as the design progresses, new products are launched, like Girard's own designs for George Jensen, which he launches in Manhattan and then sells to the Millers, who use it as their dinnerware. Or working with Herman Miller, remember he's an employee of Herman Miller, making a custom version of the Eames's couch so that looking from the back, from below, it is visually more interesting because Zinnia was very nervous that the couch would look horrible from below. And so Girard customizes it. He then writes to Eero and he says, "Won't you give me different legs for your womb chair?" Because he hated those legs. Eero does not acquiesce. There is no womb chair in the house today. Beyond all these textiles, the tableware, there is then the wonder of the storage wall that runs across the entire back of the house or front of the house. And it's opposite the garage. So it's the one side of the house where you can't have a landscape view. And so instead, you have a view into a sort of another world, a world that is much bigger than the site of the house, that is bigger than Columbus, Indiana. And Girard, working with Zinnia Miller, whom he says has a wonderful but untrained eye, and he will educate her in antiques and in folk art. They become very close friends, and he very much appreciates her sort of aesthetic sensibility. And they together collect and then style the storage wall. And it is full of glass objects, folk art, contemporary art, and paintings in the very traditional manner of the sort of Wunderkammer, this sort of cabinet of curiosities. And so again, these very traditional elements like a cozy corner, these ways of sort of Enlightenment era collecting the world and displaying a microcosm of the world in your home are repeated in this very modern environment. And Girard and Zinnia Miller will have a lifetime of collecting and sending folk art to each other. But what was it about folk art that drew them in? I think for both Girard and the Millers, folk art was a way of bringing us together as a people. For Girard, he recognized a sort of deeply human and deeply universal styling that existed across all cultures. And he attempted to infuse his design work with an intense engagement, a sort of a deeply dedicated engagement to the cultures that not only produce the folk art, but then also the sort of breadth of the world in which he could explore and shop. And so in this book that was in the Miller's archive, you see all of the places that Girard has collected works of art, and then how many pieces are from that individual culture. And so we see Girard, the sort of consummate collector, though he called himself a selector, infusing the life of the Millers with his own passion and sharing that passion to such a degree that the Millers developed their own passion of collecting. In the process of building the Miller house, Girard and his wife, Susan, would relocate to Santa Fe, where in his own adobe manner, he builds his own version of a conversation pit. In his adobe house, he fills it with some 100,000 objects of folk art, and this sort of wonder of what modernism can encapsulate. There seems to be no limit to Girard's understanding of modern architecture. And in his later design work, like La Fonda del Sol, you really see Girard expressing this much more exuberant modern design. He works for Herman Miller until 1972, when modernism takes a very different tack from what he had demonstrated at the DIA in 1949 and with what he developed alongside Nelson and Eames in the 50s and 60s. You see Girard's textile and object store for Herman Miller, which celebrated a diversity in texture, pattern, and collecting, contrasted to the direction that Herman Miller has gone, the action office system, the invention of the cubicle. And there is this great sort of parting of the ways between Herman Miller as a company, where it had a place for Girard, to where it became really a much more sort of corporate interior. But Girard doesn't give up his passion for folk art. He continues to collect, and he continues to attempt to build relationships between the United States and, in the case of the Magic of the People, with artisans in Central and South America, where, using his own sort of modern graphic sensibility, he then adapts some 10,000 objects from his collection into this celebration on the sort of universal experiences and spiritual moments of everyday life. His was a theatric understanding of folk art, and also an almost childlike study of individual figures and how they might relate across cultures to each other. Charles Eames serves as his photographer, and they both have this understanding of folk art as a sort of realm into a world that has more in common than differences. And here you see Eames taking a picture of this object with Girard standing behind him. Now, Girard will continue to work for the Millers. Mr. Miller hires Girard to come up with a new scheme of redecorating downtown Columbus, where Girard proposes a sort of color palette of 26 sort of colors inspired by Victorian architecture that then transform the main Washington shopping district. And Girard will sort of use this as a demonstration of early urban renewal that did not involve the destruction of the downtown. And the Millers really stay engaged with the architectural community. We see them here sitting in the Miller house. And I think that they could have just sort of said, okay, we're wealthy corporate leaders. We have our family home. It is perfect for all of our needs. It is beautiful. And they could have stopped there. But Miller looked out at the town of Columbus and he said, how in a country with this level of wealth, with this level of prosperity, do we have people who are living in poverty? And do we have so much strife among class and among race? And he thought, I can't fix this as a sort of benevolent billionaire. Instead, I can help enable us to have a more equitable and a more fair democracy. And he thought he could do this. He felt he could do this, and he does this with architecture. And so in 1957, he sets up the Cummins Foundation, which will pay for the architectural designs of any public building in Columbus. Irwin doesn't say who the architect has to be. Eero Saarinen helps to advise the city, but it becomes an opportunity for young visionary architects to, at the expense of Cummins' engine, provide new and experimental architecture. And this is what transforms Columbus into a modernist mecca, with buildings by Harry Weiss, a public golf course where the Millers were members and where they golfed with alongside the public, or Harry Weiss's Baptist Church, another National Historic Landmark. Architects like Edward Larrabee Barnes come into the program designing schools, and Robert Venturi sort of gives rise to postmodernism in Columbus through the same foundation, rebuilding the town's fire stations. I.M. Pei comes in as the architect of the main library with his expressive version of brutalism here for a Midwestern city. One of my favorite buildings, John Johansson's elementary school, which is this strange sort of warren of pipes and tubes connecting a visionary sort of vision of early childhood education. Kevin Roach and John Dinkeloo, Eero Saarinen's associates, will become engaged with the project both at the post office, as well as architects like Polshek designing the mental health center. And you look at the types of buildings that Miller is supporting, the types of architects he's hiring, and they are projects that are benefiting all members of the community, and they are architects who are at the very forefront of modern design. Mitchell Gergola designed a revolutionary open floor plan high school. Hardy Holzman Fiber, a center for the employees of Cummins Engine for their health, for a gym and sort of spa center. Or the Mall by Caesar Pelli, Paul Kinnan, another Cranbrook graduate, designing the telephone switching center. There was nothing that couldn't be touched by better design. And it continues on up to today, with SOM contributing a city hall, Roach and Dinkeloo designing a headquarters, and all the way up to the first woman involved in the project, Susanna Torre, who designs Fire Station number 5 shortly before becoming Cranbrook's first woman president. Now, in the last lecture, I'm going to talk about some of the buildings that are produced by Eero Saarinen and Associates after Eero Saarinen. And one of those is North Christian Church. It's designed in the very last months of Eero Saarinen's life, and it was a commission for a new church for the Millers and their congregation. It is this sort of monumental expression about what religious architecture can be in the suburbs, essentialized down to the single church spire, and then an almost Unitarian reflective opportunity where the congregation becomes the sort of central ornament. Girard told the New York Times in 1970 that interior design is really a slow motion movie of junk changing position. This change, this motion, is at the heart of youthful expression, and your household is the theater in which you live with the scenery. Among the props are few high-quality furnishings and a vast array of entertaining and temporary expendables. And this vision about what domestic space could be, that modern architecture could not build glass houses and have that really be domestic space, that modern architecture should be rich, that interior should be a slow motion movie of junk changing positions, was a unique vision that was uniquely equipped for the Millers as a client, for Eero Saarinen as the lead architect, and for Dan Kiley to build his garden of open rooms. this team will stick together, and we'll see the influence of all of them in the continued work of Kevin Roach and John Dinkeloo. For our purposes tonight, what is pretty amazing about the house is that the Millers live here until 2008, and when Mrs. Miller passes away, she gives the house to the Indianapolis Museum of Art. And that's what you see here. The home and this incredible expression of artistry, architecture, and a really unique vision of domesticity is now open for tours. I apologize for going over here, but thank you for sticking with me. We do have about 7 minutes for questions. If we will now allow you to unmute and ask any questions you may have. Well, Emma, have we let the people unmute?
Yeah,
I'll repeat a question from this morning because it was a good one, which was, what is the solar gain on this house? And I think that this would have been another tact of the lecture of is a glass house ever efficient? And I think what enables this construction of modern houses is not only the technology, the steel beams, the advanced structural systems, the plate glass windows, but it also is air conditioning. And you can't really have a house like this without air conditioning. And the house is equal on all sides. So the southern exposure is taking as much sun as any other exposure. And the house really suffered in the 50s and 60s from huge damage to the textiles and artwork from solar gain through the skylight. So not the most efficient vision of domesticity, but also that was not on the forefront of mid-century designers. I see some questions lining up. It begins in sort of late 19th century Europe, but by the sort of 1910s and 1920s, especially in Germany, you have architects like Mies van der Rohe proposing all glass skyscrapers. That seems very normal to us now because through buildings like the Tech Center, we figured out how to build glass walls, but they were proposed in the 1910s and 20s in Europe. But the very first sort of successful and famous ones are the Farnsworth House and the Johnson Glass House. What's interesting about them is that the Farnsworth House is designed first, but takes so long and is so complicated, it's finished second. So Philip Johnson wins out, but he always says, I was inspired by the Mies house. He attributes his design to Mies. He says, Mies is the master, I am the disciple. Good question. And I think of the ones that I showed, only the Hardy Holzman Pfizer building. It was that is an amazing firm that has done amazing work that gets no recognition. There are multiple versions of the Columbus Guidebook. And I should mention that the house is run by the Indianapolis Museum of Art, but Visit Columbus as well as Exhibit Columbus are two organizations that will allow you to get into many of these buildings. I only showed a very small selection and my timing was completely off, so we went really fast. But there are really a sort of endless march of modernist and then postmodernist churches, hospitals, police stations, fire stations. It is a veritable who's who, all the way up to more recent buildings in the 2010s by architects like Deborah Burke. Good question. Daniel Redstone.
Can you hear me?
Yes, there you are.
Very interesting, and we want you to do the tour again, the bus tour. It was wonderful. In the space that had the seating area, there was on one wall, there was a large, over and over again, like a large painting or mural. Could you tell us what that is? Because it's sort of unusual.
Yes. On one wall is a Monet water lily, and the other wall, I forget the name of the artist, but it is a sort of European village scene in this impressionist style. I mean, they had William Blake's, they had Hogarth's, they really had a top-notch art collection, very blue chip art collection. And Zinnia sold the collection before giving the house to the Indianapolis Museum of Art. Perhaps someone from Indianapolis could tell us exactly why, but if you visit today, things like the Henry Moore are no longer in the garden, which is actually bringing the house back closer to Girard and Saarinen's vision, though Girard was consulted and provided all the frames for this blue chip collection. In the earliest days of the house, those pieces weren't there. What's interesting is that all this attention to textiles. If you look at the house in the 80s, it has become, there are lazy boys, there are very different bedspreads. They really live in the house, and it really evolves with the couple in a way that I think Girard would have been happy. Arrow might have rolled over. Good
Thank
question.
you very much.
Kristen? Let's see, they know what they're doing. It is pretty amazing. And also, as an 8,000 square foot home, it has enough room for you to get around, which is not always the case with our little Frank Lloyd Wright house tours here. It is a generously proportioned home because you think about him as the CEO of a Fortune 500 business in a small town. There was no hotel, there was no restaurant, there was no way to entertain sort of the crowd that he had to for business. And so the house was serving that purpose as much as it was meeting sort of bridge club, church associations, and then the children and their friends. Good question. I think in photographs, it is hard to get a sense of the space and how it is illuminated and how the spaces connect to each other. And it is this interesting contradiction of when you visit Philip Johnson's glass house, you see the glass house, you step inside, and it's a very similar experience. You become impressed by the cleverness of how Philip Johnson builds a kitchen without cabinets and how he builds a bed in the bathroom. And it is exciting to visit the glass house because it is clever. When you visit the Miller house, it just doesn't look like it does in photos. And the spatial unfolding and the way that you're aware the grid is regular, but it is not lining up to the floor plate. And the sort of duality of this regular gridded skylit ceiling to then this floor plan that is a very spatial experience that doesn't relate to the grid. And just sort of what a sin that is to our sort of German modernist, and how Mies could never have allowed a grid floating on the ceiling to so disassociate from the experience of the floor. And I think that these spatial experiences, as well as just the richness of the colors, the collection, the saturation of it all, the bizarreness of it all, it just does, it is this weird sort of Victorian modern, but in a very satisfying way. Right. Good question. The house in Santa Fe is gone. It's only the McLucas house, which is a private residence. And of course, it has a giant 6-foot fence.
Oh, thank you.
Only because we went over. I'll take one more question, though I realize we're out of time. Yes, I mean, Charles Moore and Girard were friends, and they certainly are kindred spirits in their collection of folk art. In the longer version of this lecture, we would also have to relate it to people like Dorothy Draper and Carlton Varney, and thinking of the Grand Hotel in the tradition of interior decorators who are inspired by Girard. I think the difference in sort of Girard and Charles Moore is that they are always architects first and foremost, and even his designs for textiles, he says, well, textiles are an architectural material. Versus the sort of Dorothy Drapers of the world and Carlton Varneys are using a similar aesthetic, but to very different means. So I do think that Girard flings open a door about what might be appropriate in a modernist house in the same way that Eero Saarinen was flinging open the sort of what might be appropriate in modern architecture, that you can have a circular stairway suspended on steel cables within a sort of Miesian compound, that you can do a giant sculptural water tower, and it doesn't just have to look like a water tower, it can be wrapped in stainless steel. I think that there's a sort of rigor to Eero's theatricality that Girard's, his own version of rigor and his own sort of acceptance of the diversity of the world around him is much more humorous. He doesn't seem to be a terribly humorous person. His nickname was Mouse because he was so quiet and so focused on design. It is almost inconceivable that that would be his personality based on what he did. But together, they really sort of fling open what is acceptable in sort of polite architecture.
That whole thing about stuff moving around, that does seem to be kind of the actual action on stage of life. So where do I sign up for the longer version of the lecture?
Who knows? Jan, did you have a question? I'm not sure. Okay, well, we are vastly over time. My apologies. But there was really just so much to cover, even though we were only really talking about 3 members of the circle tonight. I do think that this house is a pretty amazing tour de force. And when you see it simply in a lineup of modern domestic architecture, I think you don't understand the sort of interrogation of domesticity, of what the role of modern architecture at the American mid-century might be, and how one might actually use architecture to raise a family and use architecture to make arguments about what is sort of appropriate and how one might expand your worldview through the decoration of your own home. We will be back next week to talk more about the TWA terminal, an equally theatric but very different building. We'll be revisiting many of our favorite friends, the architects who are associated with Eero Saarinen and Associates, as we get into a project that is very much a monumental team effort between architects, engineers, and designers at a completely different scale and completely different audience than tonight's Miller House. Thank you, everyone, and I will see you next Monday night.